Okay, colleagues, this video is meant as a way to share something that I've been working on with the broader teaching community and also to practice for a keynote speech that I have to deliver tomorrow to the AP Best Practices Conference that's being held in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So, for those of you not able to attend live, I want to make sure that you have a chance to think with me about these ideas of student motivation, and I also just want to get one more practice in before we go and see if I can actually do this thing in 60 minutes or not. So without further ado, let's set the timer and go ahead. Colleagues, I'm so grateful that I get to be here today with you to talk about student motivation. I'd like to make a maybe bold claim. And the claim is that AP students are some of the worst motivated students in our high schools. And I know this because even though they do a lot of motivated looking behavior, the reason that they're doing it is tends to be just for a grade, just for the college credit. And I'm going to argue that that's actually not the fullness of human motivation potential. And what that tends to lead to is students who are burnt out, students who are quickly demoralized and frustrated, and definitely students who don't experience ongoing and growing degrees of joy, excitement, meaning, purpose, and beauty in our classes. So it's helpful for me to contextualize myself for you so you can understand how I come about this, how I come at this problem of student motivation. So I'm a family person first and foremost. I'm pretty convinced about the numbers here, but my students, the students I teach, are going to have many teachers in their career. They've had many before, they'll have many after. But my children are going to have just one father. And so I want to make sure that even as I seek to do a good job in the classroom, I'm doing an even better job, more engaged job, more present job, full-hearted job in parenting my children and being a husband to my wife. But with that said, teaching is this incredibly weighty endeavor because whether you and I wanted to or not, we definitely influenced the trajectory of human lives during this past school year that we're now completing. We changed the trajectory of human lives through our work. The research vets this out. This is not really an arguable point that what classroom teachers do influences students for a long, long time. And so my work has really been about, in my career of almost 20 years, has really been about trying to figure out how do I do a good job by my students? How do I achieve optimal long term flourishing outcomes, make my classroom a part of that, but not sacrifice my life on the altar of success? And so since 2012, I've been writing toward this question. As I've written, it's gotten clearer and clearer and clearer, and it's culminated in the pair of books that you see on the screen here, which are really all about reducing my expectations for myself as a teacher down into the fundamental few things that make the biggest difference for the outcomes that I'm after. That's really what my writing is about. And this writing work has given me the opportunity to travel around the country and the world to talk with teachers, learn with them, learn from them about the obstacles that they face in their classrooms, how those relate to mine, and how the research and just classroom experience can help to solve some of these problems that face us. So you can really reduce my thinking down into this. If anything that I recommend to you today doesn't meet these two criteria, I strongly encourage you to ignore it. If it doesn't help more learning take place and at the same time reduce stress on yourself, on students, then I would say throw it out. You might as well just use whatever you've already been doing for student motivation rather than make the changes that I'm recommending. But if the changes that I recommend help produce more learning and at the same time reducing your stress, then get after them and give them a try. Let's begin by describing what school is for, and this is also what AP is for. So, schools exist to promote the long term flourishing of young people. This is why people send their kids to school. This is what kids are hoping for. Yes, if you ask them what they want to do someday, they'll give you a million different reasons, right? Every kid's hopes for the future are going to be different, or at least slightly so. But what they all boil down to is I want to experience a good life. And I would like it if the work that I'm doing here today helps towards that. But notice the second half of this statement. And it's this idea that schools uniquely advance the long term flourishing of students by helping them to master things that outside of school they're unlikely to master. So, an example of misapplying this statement would be a school where there's tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of emphasis on social emotional learning. and academics kind of get put by the wayside. And when I say academics, I mean all the classes that we ask our kids to take. So this would be a problem because I think it's very plain that the baseball coach is also interested in social and emotional growth for kids. The home is also interested in social and emotional growth for kids. The community groups that kids are a part of, the volunteering that they do, their jobs, like everyone is working towards those things. And so I'm not saying schools should ignore social and emotional learning, but I'm just saying schools must be very careful to remember that their unique role in a student's life is to advance student long-term flourishing, which includes social emotional development, by teaching them to master things. And this word mastery is why I've decided in the last few years of my career to focus so deeply on motivation. Because whether I like it or not, I can't make students master anything. Mastery isn't something that can be done to another person. In order for a person to grow more competent in mathematics or science or social studies or art, that person has to submit to two types of things. They have to do work, certain work, and then they have to do that work with care. You got to do work with care. And to go back to the argument I began with, what I would describe most AP students as is many of them are the kids who will do work, but not really with care, because again, many of them are just in it for the GPA boost or the college credit at the end. And you can't unlock the fullness of human care if all you're in it for is a grade boost or a college credit. So the question is, how do we create situations like this? This is what my student Sammy brought to me on a Monday not too long ago. So this was the last weekend I told my students that you're really going to have to study for your AP exam, because after this weekend, the next weekend we'll take our practice test, and the weekend after that will be our final exam, the national exam. So this weekend, go all in and do specifically this. Try to complete practice multiple choice questions, because my students who are ninth graders, they struggle a lot with the cognitive demands of these AP World History multiple choice questions, because you have to read a stimuli, you have to read a pretty clunky sentence, you got to read four different pretty clunky answer options, and it just places a huge tax on their cognition with where they're at right now. So I said, go practice as much as you can. I didn't really say anything besides that. So Sammy comes to me on Monday and he says, "Hey, this is what me and Caleb did." And just notice the degree of care that Sammy is putting forth of his own druthers, right? They've set up here that they're going to compete for who can complete the most practice questions. Whoever gets the least practice questions, there's some high stakes involved. You have to endure a Mario Party game as Birdo. And by the way, the Mario Party game will go on for at least 15 turns. Okay, so your suffering will not be brief. uh, even look at the attention to care under additional stuff. The amount of questions has to be of quality. Some thought is with each one. Basically, don't just speed through the question without thinking. And as if this wasn't intense enough, if one of them didn't reach the notably high bar of at least 100 questions completed over the weekend, then the Mario Party game is going to be at Peach's birthday cake, which I can only imagine is truly painful. So, in a perfect world, all of our students would do this work of motivation that Sammy and Caleb are doing. They would do this themselves. And what I'm going to argue to you is that we can actually create the conditions in which more students present this type of care. And it doesn't even need to take a ton of work. We can get rid of a lot of the things that we currently do and just do a few things at the level of excellence. So I've asked teachers, what are those things? What are those things that help students to be motivated that you've seen in your practice? And in my travels around the country, I've probably asked this to 1,000 different people at least. And I've collected hundreds and hundreds of responses. And the reason that I'm flashing these all on the screen is to show you that we don't suffer for lack of ideas about how to get students motivated. That is not the problem with student motivation in the United States. It's not that we don't know stuff that works. That's not the issue. The issue is that we have all of these ideas and there's not really any rhyme or reason to them. It's a lot of us just working our hardest to try to make things better and try to get better results in our classroom without going crazy ourselves. But it's very inefficient. So what I'm going to propose today that we do is something much simpler, much more straightforward, and much more of a surer bet of our time, effort, energy, and practice than the random things that we all do as a collective. So these 5 key beliefs, these are what I find again and again and again in the research. Several years ago, I just started to read everything I could about student motivation and how students become learners and what leads to the highest degrees of student achievement, things like this. And they kept coming up some of these same ideas. So I put them together on a list, and then I started to think about how they interact with each other. And so we're going to talk a bit about how this pyramid works. But first, let me give you an important analogy. And that analogy is this. This is perfect for thinking about student motivation, the analogy of a garden. What I love about this analogy is that if I want to be a gardener this year, I have a few options that I can do, right? I can make a garden bed behind my house and I can just leave it be. And the results of that minimal amount of work will be chaos, randomness, maybe nothing at all to harvest. Or I could take a little more effort and I could go buy some seeds from the flower place and I could plant them in there and then I could just leave it be, not do anything. Now I might get some harvest, but I won't get a bunch. But let's imagine that I decided that I'm going to really learn about gardening and I'm going to pick the right seeds that complement each other and I'm going to study how much water they need, how much sunlight. I'm going to place them wisely. I'm going to pay attention to frost advisories, pay attention to the weather. I'm going to go out there and weed. I'm going to do everything that I can. Well, now I am likely to get a much better harvest. I'm going to have way more flowers or vegetables come out of that garden than I would have otherwise. So my work matters as a gardener. My level of knowledge matters as a gardener. But I'm not actually the one making those seeds grow. Those seeds have within themselves the power to grow. And when given the right conditions, those seeds will always grow. That is how these 5 key beliefs work. Every student has within their heart the desire to believe these 5 things. No human being wants to be demotivated. You've never met a student who's super demotivated, super disengaged, and wants to be that way. Wakes up in the morning and says, I can't wait for another day of total disengagement, total frustration, total demotivation. That is not how humans work. So, how do these things work? Well, first of all, credibility is on the bottom for a purpose. In John Hattie's work, the largest meta-analytical effort ever undertaken in the realm of education, he finds that teacher credibility has double the average effect size. And this is a crazy statement of his data because what he's saying is that if my student simply believes in me, then they're going to do almost twice as good. That sounds ridiculous. That sounds like a cheesy TED talk, okay? But John Hattie is not a cheesy man, and that is information from him that we can take to the bank. And credibility is also on the bottom because without it, it's really hard to influence other things, things such as value. So consider that I'm a non credible teacher. I have a student who thinks I'm bad at my job, and I have a little mini sermon about how important AP World History is to a student's long term flourishing. That student is likely to absolutely receive nothing from my speech, or if anything, they may receive the opposite intended effect because I'm not a credible person. So credibility is on the bottom for a reason, but value is next for a reason. Because if you're a great teacher, but the work that I'm doing is pointless, I'm still not going to be super motivated up to a point. I'm gonna have limited internal resources to draw energy from if all I have is credibility. And then the same thing is true with effort and efficacy. So those are above value because who cares if my effort's going to pay off with your pointless work? Why do I care about effort if I don't have value? Who cares if I'm going to succeed if this class is pointless? As long as I get the grade that I want, I'm good. So you build these up from the bottom. You build them up from the bottom. And then finally, we get belonging. And that's on top. I want to make note of that because many times, if you're Googling, what should I do at the beginning of the year? What should I do, to help my students be more motivated? Many people are going to point to belonging. They're going to say, focus there first. But what I'm actually arguing with the design of this pyramid is that you should focus on the bottom 4 first. And what you'll often find is that belonging gets thrown in. I'll illustrate that a bit later. So let's begin by looking at practical things that we can do about credibility. And first of all, a practical image we can hold in our mind when thinking about credibility. This is the image. This is the most important concept that you can have burnt into your mind when it comes to credibility. And it's this idea that you, like a cell phone tower, are 24/7. Every minute that you're in front of your students, you're sending out signals related to your credibility. And those signals, just like the signal that goes to my cell phone, are being received and interpreted all the time, all the time. And so the question then for us becomes, what signals are most important for influencing credibility? And based on my reading of the research on credibility, I think it summarizes nicely into CCP: care, competence, and passion. Care, competence, and passion. That's really it. If you Google up, how do I become credible with students? They might use different words, but it basically all comes down to these three things. So then a question that an efficiency minded teacher like you and I will have is, okay, how do I send these signals as efficiently as possible? I'm interested in that. I would like to be credible. Yes, thank you. It sounds like that will make my job easier and more impactful, but I don't want to stress myself out in doing this. So what can I do to most efficiently create credibility in the hearts of each student? Well, first for care, we're going to need to do something called tracking attempted moments of genuine connection. It's a bit of a mouthful, so let me unpack it. Moments of genuine connection are brief, 30 to 60-second, often one-way communications with individual students in which you try to help the learner feel valued, known, or respected. And that language, by the way, comes from one of the leading researchers on belonging. Okay, Greg Walton out of Stanford. But he says, really, this is what a sense of belonging comes down to. But when I read that, I thought, well, that's also what the care component of teacher credibility comes down to as well. And this is part of what I mean, where belonging gets thrown in if you take care of things like your credibility, because you can't be credible, fully credible with the student if you don't consistently signal to them that you care. So these are just some examples in my class recently of attempted moments of genuine connection. Notice they are not that long, that they all, in this case, these all are pretty much one directional. Sometimes I might ask a student a question and respond to that question, but they're moments. They're called moments for a reason. They're called genuine for a reason because I have to find ways to value and know and respect each of my students. And you know how it is. For some students, that takes some work. Students that annoy me, frustrate me, cause me extra work, these ones can be difficult to find things to genuinely say. So I have to do that work to make sure that the signal has the best possible chance of getting through to them. And then the important thing is that you track every attempted moment of genuine connection. You actually keep track on a clipboard with all your student names on it. Because if you don't do this last part, if you don't track attempted MGCs, what you'll end up doing is giving lots of signals of care, lots of MGC attempts to two groups of kids that we all tend to be biased towards. The group of kids that we really enjoy, really appreciate, they give us energy. We don't need to keep track of attempting moments of genuine connection with them because we're going to do it. And then the kids that we're really concerned about, the students who maybe are presenting behavior difficulties or attendance issues, or they're super disengaged, we'll try extra with them. But the problem is we will often neglect to send consistent signals to those quiet students, maybe standoffish students, maybe socially awkward students who are in the middle. And this is a major, like, unforced error, I would say, when it comes to teacher credibility, because just because those students are presenting as quiet or standoffish or uncomfortable when they talk to you, it doesn't mean that their minds aren't constantly going, that they don't within themselves possess a whole world view. And so when that worldview is out scanning all the time, like they all are, and it doesn't see any signal that I care about them, then they're unlikely to find me credible. I would argue that this single strategy, which by the way, I try to do one MGC per student per month. So it's not a crazy heavy lift. This is not something where I'm filling out a whole class roster every week. No, once a month, I think does the trick, gets the job done. But I think that this strategy is why students like John write to me last week and he says, I appreciate how you always make time for us. Well, when I read that, I just think, but John, I don't. I'm a teacher whose classroom door is typically closed when I'm not teaching. You'll only ever find a student eating lunch in my room or visiting after school if that student has made an appointment with me. And this goes back to the first picture that I showed you. I want to get my work done while I'm at work. so that I can do the work of fathering and husbanding and homeowning and all that when I'm home. So this one thing will help really take care of any inconsistency that you've had previously in signaling care. Now, competence is different because competence, you can't just print out a piece of paper and do something once a month and you'll be all set. You really have to earn competence. You have to just get good at your job. And for an AP teacher, a real basic thing, some of you who are more advanced, just be patient. A real basic thing would be to know your test. Um, if there's any practice test for your AP subject that you haven't taken as a learner, like taken the full thing, looked at the scoring guidelines, tried to figure out how you missed points where you missed points, then that's something that needs to happen. And then I would encourage you to take even a little more time and buy like a Princeton review book. I've got one over there, and take the practice tests in there. Read those. This entire effort would take maybe 5 to 10 hours, a couple solid days of work over the summer, and you could have this testing experience behind you. You could have these lessons learned inside of you. And then every time that you talk to your students about getting ready for that assessment, you're now coming from this place of greater competence. Okay, so that one, if you haven't done it, you got to do it. This is the summer to do it. It's really difficult to be a credible AP teacher if you're not authoritative on what the test contains. But then the next one, this is where I'm going to bug a lot of even you advanced teachers. And it's this whole idea of fast feedback. Okay, so what I'm saying is if you want to send a bright white signal of competence to your students, then when they complete an FRQ portion of your test in class, try to give them that feedback the next day. I was first challenged to do this actually by one of the conference organizers, Luke Wilcox. He had these amazing AP statistics pass results, and I said, how in the world do you do that? And what he said is, well, you don't teach AP stats, so I'll try to generalize. One thing that really helps is giving next day feedback on written work. And I said, whoa, why? How? So let's get into some of that. So first of all, we've known since like the 1990s that fast feedback has a way different effect than delayed feedback. And of these studies that I have up here, I want you to especially make note of this one down here that talks about novices. I'm putting your attention on that because AP students are all novices. Your most advanced learner in an AP class down to your least advanced, they are all relative to your discipline novices. Okay, this is why so few students at the end of each AP season get 100% on these AP tests because these tests are very difficult, super challenging, and students are still on their learning journey. So, when you're teaching novices like you and I do, according to this study and others, delayed feedback can really hurt the instructional value of that feedback. In other words, you did all that work to give feedback and you get so little bang for your buck. And this makes sense because, like, imagine I'm playing a game, I'm playing on the JV soccer team, and I go play a game. My coach says, okay, I'll give you guys notes on your performance in 1 week. Coach gives those notes in 1 week. Well, obviously, they're not going to be very useful. I don't even remember the game. I don't remember what I was thinking when I played the game, what was going on in my mind. And the other reason that we should care about this idea of prompt or feedback is that this team of researchers back in '06, they did an interesting study where they looked at the effect of teacher misbehaviors, they called them, on credibility. And one of the categories of behavior was what they labeled as indolent, like lazy. I like this absent-minded professor language. Like, I'm super smart, but I'm kind of disorganized. I'm kind of all over the place. Like, yeah, we're having a test tomorrow. Oh no, I mean the next day. Oh yeah, I was gonna grade the papers last night, but like then my dog ate a cat and I had to go to the vet. And like it's just these people who it's not that they're bad at teaching, it's just that they don't tend to get things done or provide consistency due to these indolent patterns of behaviors. And what they found is that this pattern of returning papers late was definitely one that students noticed. So how in the world do you do that though? Well, let's just look at an example scenario. So let's say I teach two AP classes and I give a free response question in each of those classes on a Monday. And it takes me about 4 hours to grade those things with the rubric, let's say. And so I do one on Tuesday night, one on Thursday night, and then 2 hours on Saturday morning. And I give the feedback the next week. Okay. According to the research studies that I showed up here, that's going to be a problem in terms of the usefulness of the feedback. And according to this, it's going to be a problem maybe in terms of my credibility. But at least I'm doing my job, right? I'm doing my job. But what if I took those same 4 hours and I found a way, I inconvenienced myself for 24 hours, and I found a way to get that feedback done, those 4 hours completed before the next day's class? So what if while the second class was taking their FRQ, I started grading the first hour's FRQ? What if I stole a half hour during my lunch that day, closed my door and put a half hour in there? What if I did an hour and a half after school? What if I woke up an hour early the next day or stayed up an hour later than I normally do? What if I did those things and gave the feedback back? Well, on their face, these are equal. The same exact time is being spent by the teacher. But if we dig a little deeper and consider the research and just consider how it feels as a teacher to have like an outstanding assignment that you haven't yet graded, now I think it's really clear that one of these is way more advantageous than the other. So prompter feedback will absolutely make a difference. And then finally, with passion, that we're going to look at some other examples for passion later, so I won't talk long here. But basically, the way you use your class time, according to the research, absolutely indicates your credibility because it shows that time either is important in this class, and therefore what we do is important. It's important to you as my teacher, or that time isn't. But I won't belabor that point due to time. So these things, plus nothing, will dramatically increase credibility signals that are getting through to your students next year. Uh, you can email me angrily if they don't, but they will. Next, we have value. And here I'm going to start with the risk of sounding a bit like the sepia toned guy looking out the rainy window. And I'm going to state something that's a bit gloomy. And the gloomy statement is that students have a deeply impoverished view of learning. They do. This is an American education thing. So if we look at what the research says, all the ways are of coming to value something, something like learning, I would argue that most American students are heavily biased towards looking for value in these two areas. When am I ever going to use this? And how does this relate to me? How does this relate to my interests? And the problem is that in terms of K-12 motivational gardening, we tend to respond to that again and again and again and again. And so we reinforce this predominant culture that demands that learning be useful or be relevant. But this problem rears its ugly head when you have AP students learning very specific, in-depth things about disciplines that are just gonna, the higher you get in your education, the narrower the range of utility or relevance is. And so this is a problem. If all that we have for cultivating value are these top two things, we're going to be in trouble. But thankfully, these top two things actually are not the most important drivers of human value. It's really like these bottom ones where you start to get a lot of the power. I would argue that it's these bottom ones that are making Sammy and Caleb come up with their Mario Party game challenge. These are what's going on. They've captured inside of themselves a sense of meaning, significance, purpose, enjoyment, beauty in their work. And some of you might be looking at that beauty on the bottom and saying, come on, man, beauty, a moment where you feel like a small but connected part of a wondrous picture, where you long for the thing you're beholding, and so you keep beholding it. How in the heck am I supposed to do that in my AP science class? But I'm not going to tell you the answer. Albert Einstein's going to tell you the answer. And what Einstein is basically saying is that it's not utility or relevance that drives the highest levels of performance in terms of motivation. It's not those things. It's that lower stuff on the rainbow of why. Rapturous amazement at the harmony of natural law, religious feeling, strength of emotion. These are deep value words, enduring senses of value. And if that seems kind of out of reach, let's look at a math teacher who uses these exact angles in her math class. This is Caroline Ong teaching a pre-calc class in Texas.
So let's do an example. I'm going to need to erase this, but you have these on your identity sheet.
No.
Yeah, it was, sorry, Emily.
Does it work for any coefficient of X?
No, and we're going to get to that. There's this really cool thing. I love that because that's going to segue into example 2. And here's what I hear Emily asking. What if I have sine of 3x or sine of 4x or sine of 5x? That's more complicated.
That'd be like sine of x plus x plus x.
Yes, we're going to do that in a minute. Yes. Ooh, yes. Ooh, okay. There's a cool thing that happens there. We're going to take a peek into that part of the mathematical forest. We're going to go up to like the edge of the cliff and we're going to see this beautiful vista. Okay, we're not going to climb down the cliff, but we're going to see there's cool stuff out there. And then really exploring that cool stuff, it will be beyond the scope of this class. But we're going to take a look and we're going to see that there's cool stuff.
It's like you have to be a certain height to ride the ride. You can watch other people ride the ride, but you don't get to ride the ride.
Right. Some mathematical rides require some prerequisite skill before you can really appreciate the beauty and the wonder and the grandeur of the mathematics. So beautiful. You know, mathematical thinking, guys, I'm gonna get on my little high horse, my apologetic for mathematical thinking. Math we think is about solving problems, right? Useful life is about solving problems. You probably have some field you're interested in because you're old enough to be thinking about what's my life work going to be that fascinates you, and you want to solve problems. Special education, you want to solve problems for your students. You know, business, you want to solve problems for small business owners or whatever. And I don't know about the rest of you, okay? You want to solve people's physical movement problems or whatever. So there's fields you want to solve problems in, right? So mathematical thinking, we solve a problem. We don't just solve the problem. We look for the most efficient way to solve the problem. And we also look at how to communicate that clearly to other people. And that's the kind of thinking you do all the time in life. Mathematical thinking is everywhere. It doesn't look like math, but it's everywhere. Thank you for letting me get on my horse. All right, get back off the horse.
So when you look at the rainbow of Y and think about what you just saw, what do you notice? I notice there's some utility and relevance in there, but Caroline has reversed the bias of most American educators. Instead of responding to her students' felt need for utility and relevance, Caroline is instead responding to their true need, especially in a technology world, for meaning, purpose, enjoyment, pleasure, and beauty. And you see this in the way that she uses language playfully. Oh, that's a cool thing. The math forest, the vista. We're not going to climb down the cliff right now. And you see this in that mini sermon that she gives. It's like 30 seconds long. Her math is beautiful high horse, but it is packed with like a bazooka's worth of rainbow of Y signal. And what Caroline is doing is the work of creating a counterculture. This is how you have to think about value. Your students come to you from this predominant culture in which learning is not that meaningful. Careers are meaningful, money's meaningful, family's meaningful, but learning math, learning history, learning computers, like, no, that's just stuff that you have to do for school. Caroline is not about to have it, but she's not aggressive and combative. She's invitational. She welcomes her students with who she is into this world of beauty, wonder, and grandeur. And colleagues, I have to tell you, I don't see in this video a teacher who is hyper stressed about cultivating value. I see a teacher who has realized that as she seeks to cultivate these deeper degrees of value in her students, she cultivates it inside of herself. And the more she unlocks that in herself, the easier it becomes to communicate these, what I call mini sermons. And so there's this virtual flywheel-like effect in the heart of Caroline Ong. And I encourage you to try giving mini sermons that paint with the full rainbow of Y to get the same effect going stronger and stronger in your heart. So this is what I call teacher-generated signal sending. And if you're a credible teacher, it's not a negligible influence on your students' growth and value. You will have an effect. You will move a student from math is the stupidest thing ever to okay, I think maybe math might be valuable for more reasons than I thought. Or you move a student from there to math is actually valuable. Or you move students there to I love math. I wasn't planning to go into a math related field, but maybe now I will because it's unlocking this sense of beauty, wonder, significance, purpose, enjoyment, and pleasure that previously I hadn't known was possible. So teacher generated signal sending will definitely work. Okay. But you also, if you want to really have an impact on student motivation in the value area, you've got to do valued within exercises. So because of time, I don't have a bunch that I can say here, but I'll just tell you that there's a researcher named Chris Holloman at UVA, who did a series of interventions that looked like this. Students basically got a piece of paper out and they brainstormed a list of things that they valued on one side, and then they brainstormed a list of things that they had learned or done in class on the other. Then they drew lines between the two things where they saw connections. And at the bottom of the paper, they wrote about what these connections were and how science might be useful to them. And what Holloman found in this replicated series of studies, he got replicatable results in this intervention, is that students who came into the class with especially low expectancy of the value of that class, they left with a significant change. And this change translated not just to them reporting on a survey that they valued science more, but showing with their GPA that they were more motivated to do the work required for a higher grade, and showing with their course selections in later years that they were interested in science more. So, this is one way to do valued within, what I call valued within. Another way is something as simple as this. So, in my class, a pop up debate is just a whole class discussion where everyone has to stand up at least once and respond to a prompt. And at the end of each unit, I like to ask my students a question like this. It's a valued within question that also dovetails into content review and practicing speaking skills, which I'm super passionate about. And so I say, well, what's the most interesting in Unit 9 so far? Let's take a look at some students. Nolan, nice job. Way to persevere. Good moves there.
I hear Tyler talking about the Green Revolution, increasing the population, and I agree with that. I would say that with the increased population, about the introduction of social media, they gave people freedom to say what they want and gain a following audience.
I would
Yeah,
also
Logan.
agree with Logan when he said social media because you can see the advancements from like past years to today's because we still use social media. But like the most interesting about social media is definitely Instagram Reels.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
Hayden was saying social media, but I think it's like new communication such as the radio, TV, and phones because it was a big advancement and it still affects our society today.
Okay, these two young ladies right here are basically saying, notice, just use the sentence template. They're basically saying communication related technology, such as radio, TV, cellular, and social media with Instagram Reels. I don't agree because of shipping containers. They make the world go round. All right, I'm going to save you any more pain of watching me stumble through that speech and just commend this type of exercise to you. Pop-up debates, I've got a whole playlist of videos online on YouTube where I recorded my teaching notes for every pop-up debate that we did this year. That was something that I wanted to get done this year, and good job, Dave. You did it. I did pop-up debates 1 through 20 and kind of walked you through how to progress from like hyper anxiety around speaking to growing proficiency with some basic speaking structures to like really having what you saw here, which is the kids being fairly loose, fairly relaxed, sharing novel ideas, reviewing content. And oh, by the way, the whole premise of the discussion is that there's actually interesting stuff in Unit 9. It's valued within. It's a valued within mechanic. So these two things will help with value. They absolutely will have an effect on value if you do them consistently. But please just let me remind you that all of these are things that we teachers need to give ourselves space and time to improve at. You're not going to be as good at tracking attempted moments of genuine connection at the start of a year as you will be at the semester, provided that you do it consistently. You won't be as good at mini sermons the first 5 times as you will be the 20th 5 times. So this takes practice. This takes intentionality. This takes reviewing how you did and thinking about ways that you could do better in the future. But provided that you do that, and by the way, you're going to have time because you can get rid of a lot of the things that you've been doing for student motivation. If you follow these recommendations, you'll notice a big bang for your buck and a decrease in your own stress. So next, with effort and efficacy, we have to look at something that I call the effort and efficacy flywheel. In a really well-motivated student, this is what's happening. This is what's happening. They put forth effort, and it's typically going to be good effort, efficient effort. Hopefully it'll be that. Then they'll get good results from their effort. And then hopefully they'll interpret those good results as not just them being smart, but instead them working hard. And then they'll go back and they'll put forth effort again. This is what's happening in well-motivated students. The problem is for most AP World History students, if you're providing them really good practice throughout the year, most of them are, for example, going to get poor results sometimes on practice tests, or at least poorer results than they would like. And so that's a spot where things can get broken. And then they can attribute those poor results to the effort that they put in. They could start to realize it doesn't pay off, and now they don't put forth as much effort. So how do we intervene? How do we fix this when it's happening? And I'm arguing that it's happening in most AP students in the country. The first thing that we can do is woodenize everything that's conducive to learning in our class. So this strategy is named after John Wooden, who, when interviewed by people during the 60s, when he was like basically being accused of breaking college basketball because his UCLA basketball teams were so good year after year after year, they were so sure winners of the championships year after year after year that people were like mad that John Wooden was breaking basketball. When asked what the secrets to his success was, he would very often recount the story of what he does in the very first day of practice each season. And you don't need to read all the text on this slide, but just know that this is a man describing teaching 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds how to put on their socks and shoes. That's what he's doing. In other words, Wooden, in bringing this up repeatedly in his interviews and his books, he's saying there's something very important here. There's something super explanatory about my success here. And I think what's important is that Wooden leaves no learning conducive behavior to chance. There's nothing too small or nothing too big. He's going to teach it very clearly, explicitly, and reinforce it thereafter. So what I recommend that teachers do is think about all the things that your students need to do. And you can break these up into what I call smallies and biggies. Smallies are things like shoes and socks. You typically can teach them one time and then reinforce after, and you're good to go. I guarantee that Wooden didn't teach how to put on socks and shoes every single day for 3 weeks. That would have been a waste of time, and he was not interested in that. It would have been an affront to his players' intelligence, and he wasn't interested in that. So the smallies for our classes might be things like how to format an FRQ, how to deal with distractions when you're working at home, how to begin the warm-up at the very start of the class. And the biggies are going to be things like note-taking. We're going to see a student talk about note-taking here in a minute, but I want to move on to this idea of defining success, because this is the second place in the flywheel that can get broken and get students stuck in a doom loop. Many students come into our classes, AP classes, with success defined as it's getting an A, it's earning credit, it's not failing, it's proving myself to like my older sibling or my parents or my teacher. And these are really problematic definitions of success because they're very fragile. Okay. If I give a College Board approved progress check at the end of Unit 3, and I have a student who's dead set on success equals an A, and they get like 50% on the multiple choice question set, which is super common for ninth graders on those multiple choice questions. Now all of a sudden they're broken. Why would I believe that I can succeed? I can't succeed. I actually can't. I wanted an A. That was success. I didn't get it. I got a 50%. So what we're trying to do is move students into these more profitable ways of thinking. This takes lots of work, lots of repetition from the teacher. This idea of growing toward mastery, that's a definition of success that can apply to every single student. That definition self-differentiates for each individual student, because Miriam this year was a hot shot out the gate, but there was still mastery that was left for her to acquire. And Brighton, who we're going to see, he maybe wasn't as much, and he's going to talk to you about how he struggled at first. But as he starts to shift into this definition of success being growth toward mastery, he starts to change his practices. He starts to take into account some of my many lessons on note taking and my substitute teacher's lessons on note taking. So this is a really important piece to intervene. And the last thing that we can do to help with this doom loop is to unpack outcomes on a regular basis. This looks very simple in my class. After each assessment, I ask my students to answer a few reflective questions. How did things go? What were you expecting? What was difficult about it? How does that connect or not connect to the level of work that you put in? What changes do you want to make? What differences do you notice between this unit and next unit? I kind of make them up as I go, but it's meant as a chance to pause, and I explain it to my students as a chance to pause. I say really effective learners, effective people, they periodically reflect on how things are going. So that's what we're going to do right now during our warm up. You're going to spend 10 minutes responding to these questions in writing. And it's these three things that I think really make a difference like you're about to see here in Brighton. Let's take a look at Brighton describing how he once took notes for my class and how he takes them now. And as he's doing this, you're going to notice him doing some things like unpacking outcomes in his talk. You're going to also notice him doing things like shifting what he's doing this for. What is success for him? So Brighton, thanks for doing this. Let's talk about your notes.
So first semester and in the summer work that you gave us before we started the class, you gave us a couple videos like from Freeman and then PDF notes, and I started taking notes like this at first, which they were really cluttered and I didn't really know where anything was, and I just felt like I needed to get it all done at once. I just felt like I kind of needed to cram it all in there, but then I couldn't really remember it as much.
Yeah.
And it was just really inefficient at taking notes that way, because it's like, even if I was taking notes from the textbook, and I mean, I could have spread that out a lot easier.
So then what started to really change things for you? What helped you to upgrade your note-taking strategy?
So I realized like a lot of the quizzes and MCQs and SAQs and all the FRQs that we were taking, I realized that since I took my notes, like since they were so cluttered, I wasn't doing as good as I probably should have been doing on the FRQs and all the other stuff, just because like when I went to go back, look at my notes, I mean, there was so much stuff, I didn't know where to start, I didn't know where to read. I mean, I felt like everything was just so random and just writing down a lot of unnecessary stuff, and I felt like I needed to just change something. So then like halfway throughout the year, like the second semester started, and I have this whiteboard in my basement, and I started like watching the Heimler videos, and I would watch the video through like on 2x speed, and I would write down like the main ideas on my whiteboard and where like the timestamp was, and then I would so I made like a table of contents sort of on the front page of my notes, on the front page of my second notebook, and then I started taking notes like this, which Mr. Stark, like our usual sub for this class, has kind of encouraged me to take notes like this, which is a lot more efficient in finding like the main idea and then writing down the definition for it. Well, so if we learn like unit 6 or whatever, then if we have like a SAQ or some sort of FRQ on that unit, since I have like the table of contents right here and it tells me every single thing because I have the title, and then also I have it written down here on what page, and I numbered the pages, so if I need to find like my self quiz 6-1, I can go to page 11 or find it, and then it's a lot easier. So like the heavier units 3, 4, 5, and 6, which impact the most for the AP test, I can just go back and look at like unit 6, which is one of the only really heavy units I have in here since the other ones were in my first notebook, and you can just look at some of the main like ideas like diaspora or what a penal colony is or indentured servitude and other certain things. It makes it a lot easier to find certain vocabulary terms that might be important for a sort of test.
All right, man. Thank you. Anything else you want to say about notes?
If students are trying to take notes at first, you might be really stressing about the class or whatever. You just feel like you need to get so much done. You just feel like you want to prove to your teacher that you are the best out there, or that you can prove that you can do that high level of learning. But really, you don't really need to prove that much, because I mean, even if you take like really cluttered notes like this, that doesn't really show that you're good at the class or the material. These notes, which are way more efficient and less cluttered, are way easier to find stuff, and it kind of proves that you can have a way better work ethic to find your notes and prepare for a test or an exam.
So what I'm arguing with this example of Brighton is, I mean, what I'm telling you is I didn't even teach him. Like I taught him again and again and again, tried to woodenize note taking. I do this a ton in the first semester, show a lot of examples, non-examples, but I would razz this guy regularly as the year progressed. Like, dude, Brighton, you're taking so many notes. You're taking so many notes. Set a timer. Stop working on homework at 30 minutes. Like I've told you this again and again. I really mean it. But it's this like consistently woodenizing a biggie, like note taking for learning. And then he got this substitute that was really great, Mr. Stark, who gave him a different way to do it. It clicked for him. And now all of a sudden he's off to the races. He's doing things like finding a whiteboard to put in his basement. He's doing a lot extra. But that's kind of like the Sammy example from earlier, the Mario Party example. They're doing a lot extra. And it's because this care seed is growing within them and it's leading to all these outcomes that I, as the teacher, didn't do anything to produce. Just like if I garden really well, like I didn't make the zucchini grow, the zucchini just grew on its own. I just create the conditions for these things to take place. And these strategies on the slide here, those are the conditions that are really optimal for effort and efficacy. And then finally, with belonging, I don't need to say much here, which is good because I'm running out of time, because really all of these things help with belonging. So, for example, when you teach your students, when you woodenize things like note taking for learning again and again and again, because that's a biggie, it takes a lot of repetition, a lot of examples and non examples and reinforcement. You signal to your students that everyone needs this. That helps with belonging. Because basically, this is what anti belonging looks like. It looks like Hannah here, constantly asking herself, do I fit? Do I fit? Do I fit? Do I fit? And again, not a bunch of time to explain what I'm going to call the anti-belonging doom loop, but basically this is like my visualization of what the researcher describes. A student starts to think that they don't belong, and then during the work, this thought, which acts like a hamster wheel, this is constantly going. It's depressing their motivation, it's eating up cognitive resources. And so then the result tends to come out, and it's going to tend to be worse because of that previous drain on the potential of their work. And now, all of a sudden, they're going to have this moment of attribution, which is pretty much subconscious, but it's going to go in one of two ways. If I don't think that I belong, then I'm going to say, well, yeah, I succeeded, but I got lucky. Teacher took it easy on me. Teacher's not really challenging me enough or whatever. If I did bad, I'm going to say, well, it makes sense because I'm uniquely ill suited for this class. And so the solution here in my book, I only have one for belonging, because like I said, the other strategies really help too. And it's this idea of normalizing struggle. So here's something that helps a lot with where your students are currently at. So if you're watching this in May of 2024, like do this soon with any student this year who you saw go through a transition where they initially didn't think that they belonged, and then they realized that their sense of lacking belonging was normal, and then they started to do different things, and now they know that they belong. And this is all stolen from research. Like Greg Walton, who I mentioned earlier, valued, known, and respected guy, he pioneered a lot of this stuff. And this is called attributional retraining. So what you do is you ask students right now these questions, and then next year you show your new students these videos, and this will help plant the seeds of belonging earlier and help with the anti-belonging that most AP students go through. So let's just watch a few kids talk through this, and then I'll wrap things up.
Hello. I used to think that I didn't belong in this class because I have always had a low reading comprehension compared to my other friends.
I used to think I didn't belong in this class because I asked some questions that I thought were super stupid, and my pop-up debate answers were not good. I thought they were super vague and dumb.
I used to think that I didn't belong in this class because my scores weren't near as good as everybody else's.
I used to think I didn't belong in this class because I felt like I didn't know much like AP world knowledge because I kept failing like on the tests.
But I was not the only one that did poorly on MCQs in this class. This made me think that I had a chance and I was not the only one that struggled.
Then I realized that I was pretty normal and along many of my peers when my classmates weren't doing well in testing quizzes as well as me.
Then I realized that my struggle was normal because I was still learning, and we all learn at different paces.
But then I started to realize that everyone else was struggling in their own way too. if it were like the notes or like the writing portions.
I started to do Albert questions to get better with MCQs.
I improved by trying new study habits that peers and Sue recommended, and I also worked very hard to ask many questions in and outside of the classroom.
And then I started to not worry about what everybody else was getting and just focus on what I was doing.
But then I started to focus on what I didn't know and work hard on learning more things, such as the dates and what period is which.
Now I know that I belong in this class because my MCQ scores went up and I felt more confident in my pop-up debate answers, and I started to feel better in writing essays.
Now I know that I belong because I'm a part of the 100% that passed the exam.
And now I know that I belong in the class and everyone else struggles too.
Now I know that I belong because my scores started to go up by the end of the year and I started having a good time in class.
All right, so here we see a lot of those things that I said earlier are lacking in AP students. Things like enjoyment, things like a sense of progress and purpose. And by the way, it's these students all being able to, all 60 of my ninth graders this year were able to talk about challenges that they've had. This is why I'm so passionate about AP's access policy, because I think that AP, it's like the challenge is built in. I don't need to find ways to make the class harder than it already is, because the test is really, really hard, especially for ninth graders. And so my job is just to facilitate my students growing toward the mastery required to do well on that test. So all that we've looked at is a handful of strategies. And I again want to compare that to the hundreds, if not thousands, that I've received from teachers, things that work for student motivation. There are a million people out there trying to tell you how to motivate your AP students. And I think that they all come from a good place, just like all these people on the left side of the screen come from a good place, but I find them lacking in efficiency. I find that they often don't pass the more learning, less stress rubric that I told you to grade all my work on here. So this is the stuff. This is the stuff that if I have any authority for you, any credibility with you, I'm giving you permission to get rid of all the extraneous things that you do for student motivation and just try to become really intentional, really open-minded about doing these things again and again and again, watching what happens, responding just like a good gardener does in their garden. I'll close with this little plaque that Fred Rogers used to have in the studios there in Pennsylvania. And it was a quote from the Little Prince that said, "What is essential is invisible to the eye." What I'm arguing to you, colleague, is that these 5 key beliefs are essential to student motivation. You can't have well-motivated AP students without the presence of these 5 key beliefs. And based on where schools are at today, these 5 key beliefs are very rarely going to just come to you fully activated. That's not the system within which we teach. I don't know of any system that perfectly does that, and ours definitely is not one of those. So, but at the same time, these are manageable. I find this to be a manageable workload. It allows me to see these little magic moments, like some of my students have shown you today, where once there was a lack of care, now there is care growing. Where once there was a lack of value, now there's value growing. Now there's effort growing, efficacy growing, belonging growing. I thank you very much. My contact information is here. I have a few spots in my schedule next year where I could work with individual schools. I have a newsletter that I put out to teachers during the school year. It goes out twice a week, short articles that touch on many of the strategies and themes that I did today. And of course, I have a book where I did the work of presenting all these things in a much more in-depth and comprehensive way. Thank you for considering looking into any of those opportunities. Thank you very much, colleague. I wish you the best.